Well, welcome back to Equipped to Engage. Over the last session, we talked about this idea of the good life and how we can lead toward the good life. And we began to wrestle through questions about the good life and the fact that different people have different ideas of what it means to truly live the good life as they understand it. But the reality is that because there's competing definitions of the good life, not all of them can be of equal value. And so our job is to try to figure out, as human beings, what is the reality of the world in which I live? I think back to a conversation I had with a good friend of mine years ago. We had grown up in the church together. We had done youth group together. We'd even done Bible quizzing and a variety of other things. And later in life, both as adults, he walked into a coffee shop that I happened to be sitting in, and so it gave us a chance to catch up a little bit. So I sat down with him and I said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And he said to me, "You know what? I've never been better. I finally decided to abandon Christianity." Well, that got my attention, caught me a little bit by surprise. I said, "Well, that's interesting. Tell me more about it." He said, "Well, I'm on the path of exploration and discovery. I'm pursuing truth." I said, "Well, that's really good, because of course we all should be on that path of trying to understand the truth of the world in which we live." But I posed a basic question to him, and it's this: how do you know when you're going to find it? And he paused for a second and he thought, "Well, I haven't thought about that." And it struck me, because here's a skeptic. He had understood the basic tenets of Christianity, and as he got older, he became more skeptical about all that, had decided to abandon it in pursuit of this spiritual quest of finding truth, but he hadn't actually gotten to a point where he'd begun to understand what it was he was looking for. And so it'd be like looking for arrowheads in a cornfield. If you don't know what an arrowhead looks like, you might find this kind of triangular shaped rock and go, "Well, that's kind of interesting," and then just chuck it away because you don't understand what it is you're actually looking for. And there's a lot of people out in the world right now, maybe you're one of them, who is on this quest trying to understand the reality of the world in which we live. I can tell you confidently that there is a good life. There is a good path to the truly good life if we're willing to try to understand true reality. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this session. Because in order for us to be able to understand the path to the good life, then we also have to understand what are some of the competing ideas and underlying belief systems that people have. What are those things that cause us to really take a particular approach in life, and are they consistent with the path to the good life? Back in the 1930s and 40s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor, a writer, and a theologian, was put into a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. His crime was that he was part of one of the assassination attempts on Adolf Hitler. And tragically, on April the 9th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged in that concentration camp just weeks before the Allies liberated the camp. But it raises a fundamental question. And this is a question I want you to be thinking about. Do you think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a Christian and as a pastor, should have been involved in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler? It's not necessarily an easy question, but I want you to sit there with yourself or with the people that are around you and answer that question or wrestle with it for a few minutes. Do you think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a Christian and as a pastor, should have been involved in an assassination attempt on a head of state like Adolf Hitler, knowing what we know now? Do you think you should have done that? Take some time to talk about that, and we'll be right back in just a few minutes. Well, I hope you had a good and hopefully robust, maybe even controversial conversation or even thought process if you're watching this by yourself on this fundamental question of, should Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a Christian and as a pastor, been involved in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler? It's not quite so clear. But the reality is this. We all are like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And what I mean by that is, it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's worldview that influenced the decision-making that caused him to be a part of that. And frankly, it was his worldview that led to his martyrdom for the sake of his Christian beliefs. But every single one of us is in a similar situation where we have a worldview and it shapes the way that we live and the way that we lead in the world. In fact, here's a key idea. How we think shapes what we believe, and what we believe determines how we live. How we think shapes what we believe, and what we believe determines how we live. It's important for us to understand that, not only for our own sake in terms of why do I believe what I believe, but also why do the people around me believe what they believe? Because the fact of the matter is, everybody has a worldview. Now you might be asking, what is a worldview? That sounds kind of philosophical and theoretical and academic. But put simply, a worldview is how a person views the world. If you think about it as a pair of glasses, how you view the world shapes then everything that is coming into your eyes and into your mind and into your actions and things like that. So how a person views the world then is based on underlying assumptions about the world or presuppositions, some key ideas that people might have that then shape why they live the way that they do. Everybody has a worldview, but here's the key piece. Whether they realize it or not. Everybody has a worldview, but they may not even realize that they have that underlying worldview, and whether or not it's logically consistent. Chuck Colson, the great cultural engagement leader, put it this way. He kind of talked about it as a smorgasbord, right? Where people might come up and they might take a little bit of this and take a little bit of that. I like this idea. I don't really like that idea, but I like this idea over here, and bring them all together, and it becomes my worldview. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's logically consistent, but it is the way that I attempt to live in the world. And so it's important for us to realize that a person's life choices and daily decisions are impacted by their underlying worldview, whether they even realize it or not. Now, the challenge for us as leaders and as Christians, really, people who are trying to influence the world, is to try to help folks understand that there is a reality. I can choose to believe that gravity doesn't exist, but if I were to jump off a cliff without a parachute, the reality of gravity would become very real very quickly. And so there's a lot of people that can choose different beliefs, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. The question is, does it match up with reality? And when you think about different worldviews, we can get into a lot of philosophical ideas, right? The fundamental idea of atheism or theism, polytheism, pantheism, things that we maybe learned back in college. But it all boils down to the fundamental question, does God exist or not? That's the key question that people wrestle with either consciously or subconsciously. Does God exist or not? And our answer to that question carries significant implications. So what I wanted you to do during this next break is to wrestle with this question, and it's this. Why is the existence of God, does God exist or not, why is that such an important question that undergirds so much of how we live? Take some time yourself, begin to think through that, or talk with those that might be watching with you on why this existence of God question is so important, and we'll be right back. Well, I hope you were able to do some good thinking and maybe even some good conversation on this fundamental question of why the question of God's existence is so foundational to this underlying worldview idea. In fact, Dr. Mortimer Adler said this. He said, more consequences for life and action follow from the affirmation or the denial of God than from any other basic question. And more recently, Nancy Pearcey put it this way. The choice is simple. Either God created us or we created God. So this idea of the existence of God is one of the most fundamental questions that we have to wrestle with, and it provides the groundwork for some of the basic philosophical worldviews that we have. As I mentioned previously, obviously we've heard a lot about atheism and the idea of skeptics that embrace atheism or agnosticism, which centers around the existence of God. So there's atheism, but there's also theism, which is a belief in one God. In addition to that, there's polytheism, the belief in many gods, or pantheism, the belief that all is God. And every worldview, ultimately, no matter how it plays out in whatever religion or belief system, has to wrestle with some primary questions. And they're the questions that really get down to the fundamentals of life. The first one centers around our origin. The question is this: where did we come from? We know we're here, but where did we come from? How did we get here? So origin is key. The second question is our human condition. What is wrong with the world? We can look around, we can see in the media and on our social media feeds, it seems like oftentimes the world is on fire, and that there's so many tragedies going on, so much injustice, so many things that we say, hey, that is not right. We know deep in our souls that something is wrong with the world. It's our condition. But it leads us to the third idea and the third question, and that is our salvation. What hope is there? Do we have any hope? Or are we just destined to live within this world on fire? The fourth question is this: our purpose. Why are we here? Oftentimes, young people will wrestle with that, right? They'll think about, well, why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? Trying to find purpose and meaning and value in life. And finally, the fifth question, which is our destiny. Where are we going? Or put simply, what happens when we die? We know that death is a part of life. It is part of this reality of the human condition in which we find ourselves. But what actually happens when we die? A lot of people believe, well, as long as they were a good person, yeah, they'll be in heaven. Is that true or not? How do we know? How can we find out? So these 5 questions: where did we come from? What is wrong with the world? What hope is there? Why are we here? And where are we going? Are basic questions of the human experience. And they're the kinds of questions that every person wrestles with in some form or another. Now, we could spend a lot of time unpacking this in more detail, and it would take more time than we have even in this segment. But we're going to put together a bonus segment so that we can talk about this in more detail, because I think it's really, really important for us to understand these different ideas and begin to make those connections, at the very least, so that we can understand where our friends and neighbors are coming from. What is it that they believe? What is it that they are trying to figure out in terms of how they answer these questions? Ravi Zacharias, one of the greatest Christian apologists for the 20th and 21st century, he made this point. He said every worldview has to answer 2 basic questions, and that is it logical and is it livable? Is it logical? That means, is it logically consistent? Is my starting point idea consistent with then some of the other ideas that I hold? But secondly, is it livable? Does it actually make sense in the real world? It's one thing to believe something in theory, but once it's applied to the real world, it doesn't actually work. It's that idea I talked about a few minutes ago about gravity. I can believe that I can fly, but gravity, as a result of the reality of the world in which we live, would tell me that I need some aid or resource in order to make it possible for me to fly. Well, there's a lot of other ideas that may sound great in theory, but in reality, they don't work. They're either illogical or they're not livable. And our challenge as human beings is to really wrestle with and to follow the evidence where it leads, to figure out, is the worldview that I am holding consistent with reality? Is it logical? Is it livable? For this next segment, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about some different ways that we see ideas that are illogical. People say, I want to believe this, but I also want to believe that. And if we take some time, you probably already have identified some of those things. Take some time with your group, talk through that, and we'll come back in just a few minutes and pick up the conversation. Well, I hope that you were able to really take some time to think through and to identify ways that we see some inconsistency on how other people may live out their worldview, or more personally, how we might live out our worldview. We might believe one thing, but when we actually live it out, it isn't consistent with what we say we believe. And really, the real question is this: how do we know what's true? That's the key, right? We all want to figure it out. It's like my friend from years ago in that conversation that we had. How do we know truth when we see it? How do we know an idea is true versus something that maybe the masses, even a majority of people may believe? Just because a majority believe it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And as Tom Tarrant said, ideas have consequences because they lead to actions. Oftentimes we don't talk in the idea space that much, right? We talk very practical, or we talk sports, or we talk kids' activities and things like that, and that's all well and good. But we have to make sure that we understand the underlying ideas. So how do we know what's true? I had a friend years ago who worked with the Secret Service, and of course, they are the ones who are responsible for the Treasury, and a big part of what they do is identifying counterfeit money. Now, this is not counterfeit. This is an actual $20 bill. But I asked him one time, how do you figure that out? How do you know what to watch for? Now, we might think, for example, the best way to identify counterfeits is to study counterfeits and to know all the intricate details that deviate from a genuine bill. But he said it's the exact opposite. They study the genuine bill so that they can quickly identify some detail that is false. And it's the same thing with worldviews. In order for us to understand false worldviews, it's important for us to understand the true worldview. Our job as Christians is to come alongside people and to take off the glasses that they might have been wearing, that the prescription was off just a little bit. In fact, maybe their eyesight was a little fuzzy and they weren't seeing things quite as clearly as they thought they were. And to take the worldview glasses of the Christian worldview and say, hey, try these on and see what you think. See if this makes a little bit more sense of the world in which we live. But the key thing for us is this. It's important for us to make sure that, as Paul says in Colossians 2:8, he says this: see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human traditions and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. And in another place, in 2 Corinthians 10:5, Paul then says, we take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. So as Kirby Anderson, another apologist, pointed out, he says, we have to guard against being taken captive by false ideas and false religions and so forth, and instead take captive every idea that's presented to us. Run it through the filter of the Christian worldview, through God's Word, so that we can understand whether or not it is a counterfeit idea or if it is genuine and real. We are either going to be taken captive or we will take captive. And that's my challenge for you, is to begin to understand what is it that you believe. And if it is not consistent with truth, then what needs to change? That's the question I want to leave you with today. What is it that you believe? And if it is not true, then what might need to change? As we move into the next episode, we're going to begin to unpack further this idea of what exactly is the Christian worldview. Is the Christian worldview a slice of reality? Is it reality? If it is, then what do we need to understand about it? But in the meantime, it's important for us to do that self-assessment. As a reminder, we're going to be doing a bonus episode focusing on some of these worldviews in more detail for those of you who might be interested. And we'll have a couple of charts and things that will be a part of this so that you can further your study in that. But thank you very much again for being with us this week on Equipped to Engage, and we'll see you again soon.